Do you have a paranormal encounter you'd like to share with us? Send us an email with your story for a chance of it being featured on Weird World. Step into the latter half of the 20th century as we explore 4 more true and extraordinary accounts of inexplicable paranormal encounters from the 60s, 70s and 80s. From a perplexing journey home in Andover, New Jersey, a mysterious creature in Wichita Falls, Texas, to a haunting presence in San Diego, California, and a prophetic daydream in Denver, Colorado. Here are 4 tales of bewildering and authentic experiences that inspire both wonder and unease. Home time. In 1985, Vicki Nolan resided in Andover, New Jersey, where the drinking age had recently been increased to 21. Consequently, she found herself travelling to a bar situated on the border of New York State every Saturday to enjoy music and dancing. Her journey home, a tedious drive of 90 minutes through the northern parts of New Jersey, took her to her mother's house. One particular Saturday night, she decided to leave the bar at precisely 1:30 a.m, remaining sober out of fear that drinking might cause her to fall asleep whilst driving. Despite having a good night's sleep the previous night, Vicki found herself battling fatigue. After reaching a distance of just 4 miles from her mother's house, an overwhelming sense of sleepiness washed over her. In the frigid 0-degree weather, pulling over wasn't an option. She was afraid she would freeze to death. She continued to push on, reminding herself that she only needed to stay awake for a little while longer. A recent incident involving a friend who had fallen asleep behind the wheel after leaving the same bar and totaled his truck, though thankfully unharmed, served as a stark reminder of the risks of driving tired. As she navigated up a lengthy hill, the windy road branched to the right. Vicki couldn't help but notice the size of the moon that night. It seemed so large in the sky that even a plate held at arm's length would not be big enough to cover it. She stared in awe, finding the view oddly rejuvenating. It was as if she could see every crater magnified 100 times over. The sight was so captivating that she wanted to stop the car and observe it, but she kept driving. Upon reaching the top of the hill, the road swerved 90 degrees to the left, and a deep wooded valley filled the landscape behind her. Then she noticed a light some miles behind her, moving as if descending a hill. However, there was no hill or road to be found in that direction. Suddenly, a bright spotlight shone into the rear side window of her car, casting a reflective glow on the back seat. Vicki found herself puzzled as she glanced into the rearview mirror again. The light, previously singular, had now split into 2, and they seemed to journey in parallel to one another. She wondered if they were 2 motorcycles, but it was strange that despite a brand new car and the absence of radio noise, she couldn't hear their engines. Even though she was driving quite fast, the lights managed to catch up to her in mere minutes. As the bright lights drew directly behind her, she exclaimed in surprise, "What the hell?" And that was the last thing she was able to recall. She was fully awake, yet she had no memory of driving the last 2 miles to her mother's house. She found her car parked peculiarly at the bottom of her mother's driveway, a location she typically didn't choose. It should have been about 3 a.m, yet the sky bore a slightly pink hue, hinting at a rising sun. Given that it was January, she realised it must be closer to 7 a.m. She thought of checking the clock to confirm the time, but the strangeness of a memory lapse over the last 2 miles overwhelmed her, and all she wanted was to head to bed. The incident troubled her. She found it disconcerting that she was so alert before and after those missing 2 miles of her journey. She regretted not verifying the time, as she always had an obsession with being aware of it. Before that night, she had a fondness for observing the moon, but after the incident, she began viewing it with a hint of suspicion. The experience of lost time was something she could not forget, and although she considered undergoing hypnosis to uncover what truly happened, a strange but palpable fear held her back. A decade later, Vicki saw a television show where someone had experienced a similar situation. Another 2 decades later, she had a co-worker who was an enthusiast of UFOs and often became the butt of jokes. She shared her story with him, which caught the attention of her boss. To her surprise, her boss admitting to having experienced something similar, but in Alaska. Realizing she wasn't alone in her experience brought her an unexpected sense of relief that continues to this day. Creature Next Door. John Francis Enright spent his early years growing up on a family farm. However, in 1962, during his first grade year, his family relocated to Wichita Falls, Texas, where his father pursued a teaching degree. This was a challenging period for John, as he had to adjust to both school and his initial encounter with city life. He felt out of his depth, but fortunately, he made his first friend early in the new year. Having lived in rural West Texas, he had a rather lonely childhood and struggled to interact with peers who weren't immediate family. His new friend lived just a couple of houses down and across the street, and they walked home together every day. One afternoon, his friend started to amuse him with stories of a mysterious creature residing in his yard. Given John's fascination with all the novel and peculiar things he was encountering in his new environment, this narrative completely captured his imagination. Over several days, he prodded his friend for more details and a chance to witness the thing. After much persuasion, his friend finally acquiesced, leading John on a monster hunt in his yard. The yard, fenced in stages, housed a detached garage with an isolated plot of ground along one side, a narrow strip devoid of any entry point. This was supposedly the creature's territory. Tiptoeing to the corner, they peeked around, gripped by a formidable tension. What John saw appeared bipedal and vaguely reptilian, standing upright in a stature akin to a petite woman. It had a dark, dull green hide, splotched with brown and dark grey in a detailed, intricate pattern. As they watched, the creature turned as if aware of their presence and advanced towards them. They both screamed, running away in terror, John to his own house and his friend to his. His mother managed to calm him down, and shortly after they returned to their farm for the weekend. Growing up surrounded by the wilderness, John was no stranger to the dangerous creatures of the woods, having encountered several himself. He recognized beasts of all kinds, but the one he seen in his friend's yard was different. It was a creature he couldn't identify, even though he'd seen it in as clear a light as one could hope to see it, and up close. Determined to learn more, he planned to question his friend further. However, upon his return from the farm, he found that his friend and his family had moved away. Eventually, John mustered the courage to investigate the yard on his own, but found no sign of the creature. His vivid experience had left him with the certainty that he'd indeed seen something clear and unambiguous. Decades went by and John had come to believe that he had fooled his young mind into believing the encounter. Though he'd never forgotten the incident, he gave up trying to understand or classify what he had witnessed. But in 2008, late one night, as he was preparing for bed, he came face to face with the same creature from his childhood. The reptilian being was standing in his living room across the hall, less than 6 feet away. Over the years, he has striven to comprehend these experiences, studying a great deal and at times choosing to ignore the entity in the hope that it would vanish. So far, it appears to have done so. David. In 1975 in San Diego, California, Sonia Barcliffe found herself renting a room in a home alongside 4 students from San Diego State University. Not long after she moved in, peculiar occurrences began to unfold. She would discover items such as pens or coat hangers placed beneath the bottom sheet of a bed. Whenever she removed these objects, they seemed to reappear at the same spot within a short while. This led Sonia to suspect that a ghost might be inhabiting her room. During meditation, she visualized a young man with long, dark hair, who she perceived as David, attempted to offer her a flower. As weeks passed, the presence of this entity grew increasingly oppressive. Ultimately, Sonia couldn't hold back any longer and shared her experience with one of her roommates. Upon inquiring if her ghost had a name, she revealed it as David. At this revelation, her roommate turned pale, briefly left the room, and returned holding a photograph of a young man bearing long dark hair. Sonia confirmed that the person in the picture resembled her spectral visitor. It was then her roommate revealed the chilling truth. The young man in the photograph was his brother David, who had succumbed to drug overdose in the very room she was occupying. Fearing it might dissuade her from renting, nobody had shared this information with her earlier. Following this revelation, Sonia borrowed a book on hauntings from the library, aiming to find a way to help David's spirit move on. After closely following the instructions laid out in the book to guide spirits towards the light, she performed the ritual. From that moment on, she was no longer disturbed by David's presence. I decided I would jump. In June 1986, while travelling in a car with her husband in Denver, Colorado, Linda Gale found herself daydreaming about a hypothetical situation. What if she was crossing the street and a car was about to hit her? She concluded that she would jump to protect her niece from the impact. Fast forward to December 16, 1988, at around 4:15 p.m, and her daydream became a terrifying reality. As she was walking home from the post office, Linda was hit by a car. The impact momentarily knocked her out, and her body was flung 25 feet from the scene of the collision. When she regained consciousness, the driver of the car, who had stopped alongside many others, remarked, "You jumped so high." Eerily, the accident occurred at the exact location where she'd had her daydream 2 years earlier. Linda was just 2 blocks away from her home, right on her own street. The car was a grey Mercedes, and her daydream's decision to jump had effectively saved her kneecaps from being obliterated in the collision.